Namaste and good afternoon, everyone. Actually, when I saw the title of my sort of presentation, the first thing that came to my mind was the debate between Rabindranath Tagore and Gandhiji. Some of you may remember from your civics and history books, a big debate happened between the two of them about how the winds would blow in or not. And Gandhi was initially of the opinion that we should be very strict and rooted in our culture, and we should be somewhat apprehensive about the outsiders and the influence from outsiders, right? And the debate that happened between Gandhi and Tagore, ultimately I think Gandhi also agreed largely with Tagore on this issue. And I think there's a famous quote of Gandhi that says, "I want to be rooted in my house, but keep my doors and windows open so that the wind from the world would blow through," right? But at the same time, obviously, he thought that he wants to stay put in the house that he was in, but he will keep the windows and doors open, right? I think that's, in a sense, is the debate about the foreign universities in India. As Poonam mentioned, we have been working in this sector for a long time, trying to argue that we should be more liberal, more open in the education as we have been in the industry area since 1991, right? There are several bills actually were drafted under UPA. One or two of them came rather close to getting at least being given to the standing committee and maybe passed, right? Nothing really came off those bills, right? And there are a lot of, I'm sure some of you were involved in that discussion. Quite a robust discussion happened in terms of how do we open the space for foreign universities in India. My hope is that with the new education policy, at least the thinking that you see in the current draft document tells me that they are likely to be far more open than we have been so far in our policies to the foreign colleges and universities. Right. So there are three things that I like about the NEP, and that gives me some hope that we will be far more open as we move forward in articulating the vision behind the NEP and then finding a way to implement it, right? The first thing I think is one of the biggest paradigm shift in the governance of education in India, and that is the separation of roles or functions or powers of the Department of Education, right? So far, a Department of Education at the state level, obviously much of the delivery is at the state level, not at the central level, right? So ministry is not directly involved in this area. So Department of Education actually does several functions or performs several roles simultaneously, right? It's largely a policy maker. It is also a regulator. It is also an assessor of quality. It is also an adjudicator. The dispute between a school and the department policy, you go to the same department for adjudication, right? It is also a funder, and it is also a service provider. It also runs the government schools and sometimes colleges, right? All of those functions are performed by one single department and supervised by one single Secretary of Education, right? And that you can easily see once you begin to think along those lines is a disaster in the making. Right? No one single person can perform all of those roles effectively. There is an inherent conflict of interest between being a service provider on one hand, running government schools, and also being a regulator on the other, an assessor of quality. Right? Those two just cannot go together. Right? And so one of the things that has happened around the world is what they call agencyfication. Creates independent agencies which are tasked with specific roles and functions. Right. So, for example, in UK, there are 17 different agencies that overall regulate the education space, right? Out of those 17, there are 2 which don't even report to the Ministry of Education. They report directly to the Parliament, right? So the separation of powers and separation of functions, right, and the oversight on those functions is taken to that level, right? While in India, we are simply one department doing all of those things, right? Even I think in the Indian experience, in other sectors, right, telecom, banking, finance, insurance, right, airlines, right, what we have seen is the separation of roles, right? So in telecom, we have the ministry or the department that makes a telecom policy, in a sense. There's a telecom regulator, TRAI. There's the TD SAT, which is the adjudicator of disputes, if there's a dispute between regulator and the private service provider. And of course, there are service providers, both government and private. We still have BSNL and sort of VSNL in existence, right? And so that separation of function has enabled the degree of competition and fairness, level playing field in the sector that has given us one of the cheapest rate of telecom service, right? And that, I think, is a very central idea of governance change that is in the NEP, right? Now, I'm very hopeful that if you actually implement that systematically, thoroughly, and consistently, we would see a dramatic change in how education is run in the country, right? So that's one sort of piece of hope. Second is the focus on learning outcomes, broadly defined, right, as a metric for regulation, right, as opposed to inputs and infrastructure, right? Some of you know that at least in the school education, which is also true in higher education, right, much of the regulatory function is focused on inputs and infrastructure. What the plot of land that you have, how many square feet of construction have you done, right? What are the number of faculty that you have or teachers you have? In RTE, Right to Education Act, for example, they also specify how many books that should be in the library, right? A classroom cannot be less than 300 square feet, right? So all of that focus on input and infrastructure is slowly moving out, and focus is now on outcomes. And I think that also creates more level playing field between Indian institutions and the foreign institutions, right? So you're going to be judged by what you achieve, not so much by what infrastructure you build, right? So that's the second sort of piece of hope, which is the focus on learning outcomes as a metric for regulation and not so much input and infrastructure, right? And a third, which I think particularly relevant for higher education, is the opening of online and blended learning, right? So far as you know, we don't allow a degree to be earned simply through online or blended learning. You have to be in a face-to-face contact in the same room with the professor, right? Otherwise, you cannot have that degree. While I think, at least in the draft document, they are far more open and talking seriously about how can we enable much of the education to happen online, and could be also much blended, some, of course, contact, but not as much as we require today, right? So if you combine these three aspects of governance and regulatory change, right, policy change, separation of functions, focus on outcomes, learning outcomes, not so much on input infrastructure, and particularly open to sort of MOOC and blended learning modules, even to the point of having a degree being earned through that means. I think once you have those three things, the debate over foreign versus domestic largely should go away, right? Because if any institution that meets those requirements, right, which are properly governed, regulated by the assessor on one hand, which is independent, right, of the regulator, which is independent of the policy-making body, which is the RSA, the national body they have created, right? So to me, it seems that much of the debate around private versus public to some extent, as well as local or domestic versus foreign, should be subsumed by the new governance structure, right? If it is obviously implemented thoroughly, consistently, and in full sort of letter and spirit, right? So my sense is that that's one way to think about what is likely to happen. Of course, we know in India it's always very hard to predict what is really going to happen, right? But that's at least is a thinking that you read between lines and sometimes very explicitly in the draft new education policy, right? One thing I also see happening in higher education particularly is the separation is very strict, far stricter than what is in the school education domain, right? In higher education, for example, the UGC, the University Grants Commission, is really going to be limited to giving grants, as the name says, not be a regulator of the institutions, right? Or not even assessor of institutions, quality, right? So their job will be simply to give grants, right? So they have separated regulator, policy maker, right? Assessor, which is NAC kind of accrediting agencies, right? And funder, right? Which is going to be something similar to UGC, which only job would be to fund institutions as well as individuals in the private sector as well as in the public sector, right? So treat all of them rather equally based on the outcome parameters which will be assessed by a third party, something like a NAC kind of agency, right? So I think that certainly is a very robust governance architecture, right? So that separation of roles makes a very good sense, right? We also have been involved, I mean, CC has obviously, as Poonam mentioned, we have been think tank doing a lot of work in the policy area. But lately, we have a project that we have taken over, which is to start a public policy school or a one-year program in training people in public policy as a postgraduate certificate or diploma, right? And we have been sort of going through a lot of regulatory aspects of what is required to be compliant to run a postgraduate program in India, right? And I think very quick realization was that we are not going to be able to compete and meet any of the standards which are required, right? We also realized that we don't really need to do a 2-year master's program, which is what UGC recognizes, or AICTE, right? So most master's programs are supposed to be 2 years in India, right? So we are doing actually 1-year master's program. We think that we can pretty much provide students what they need in 1 year as opposed to what normally happens in 2 years, right? I actually met a president of a university in UK, which is a private university, which gives you undergrad degree in 2 years, right? So the typical 3- and 4-year undergrad degree, right? So they have figured out that there's a lot of time that goes to waste in a way, and that can be more effectively utilized, right? And people learn what they need to learn in a classroom in a quick period of time, right? So of course, there are pros and cons, we can argue on both sides, but at least gives you a different way of thinking about what education look like, right? And I think my biggest belief is that ultimately education should be very personalized, to cater to the needs of the student individually, what they need, to be geared to meet their learning styles and habits, right? And to be completely open to be chosen by the learner, right? So we have a lot of education which is decided by the adults, in a sense, right? What would be ideally good to do is to allow students and parents to be in charge of deciding what should education be, right? And I think that kind of empowerment of the citizen is what I think would be an ultimate goal for the new education policy. Thank you.